One particular animal species, our own, is changing the character of the surface of the Earth, its seas, and its atmosphere.
If we don't take responsibility for the very land that we stand on, then of course we're not really understanding the interconnectedness of life itself.
Remember, we don't burn fossil fuels to annoy Al Gore. We burn it because it brings us food, it brings us heat, it brings us cool, it brings us all the stuff that we like about civilization.
Try and prevent the developing world from burning fossil fuels, therefore, is, in my book, the most profoundly immoral thing that anybody could seek to do.
Welcome everybody. It's an unsurprisingly packed house. It's a great privilege for me to be sharing the stage with such an eminent panel who are going to discuss what seems one of the more intractable debates of our time, the debate about climate change. For some, it seems nothing less than the future of humanity is at stake. For others, there really is nothing to worry about.
Climate change for me is a symptom of something far larger. I see this within a context of actually we have an awful lot of problems at play here. And for me, the most important thing is that we start taking responsibility. We start taking responsibility for the mass damage and destruction that we are causing to the world. That can, in itself, create climate change reactions, may not. And what I've proposed to the United Nations is that we create an international crime of ecocide. By doing that, what we do is we impose a legal duty of care on people in positions of responsibility, what's known in law as superior responsibility. Those few who sit at the top that make decisions that can have adverse impact on many, many millions of people beneath them. So that means about imposing a legal duty of care on CEOs, on directors of companies who may be causing ecocide as a result of their corporate activity. It's also about imposing a legal duty of care on nations to give assistance to those who are adversely impacted by ecocide. Because ecocide isn't just corporate ecocide, we have naturally occurring ecocide as well, rising sea levels. Now that gives rise to an ecocide when you have mass damage and destruction and loss of ecosystems. And at the moment, no head of state, no government has a legal duty of care to give assistance to those countries that are looking at rising sea levels. And we have 54 small islands that are standing there saying, help us. Within the next decade or so, we're looking at mass homelessness issues here. But it's more than that, actually. It's about also creating an international legislative framework that really is a practical solution, because really this is about prioritizing a practical solution. It's about moving forward and saying only by having an international legislative framework that imposes a superior responsibility on those who make the decisions about our lives can we ensure that we create a governance system that protects not just my right to life. In essence, this is what it comes down to, because if we destroy the earth, we destroy our ability to live well in this world. But also, the right to life of future generations. And it takes it further. It's actually about the right to life for the earth itself. And this is about us expanding our cycle of concern. It's no longer just human-to-human engagement, because ultimately, if we don't take responsibility for the very land that we stand on, then of course we're not really understanding the interconnectedness of life itself. And we now have that knowledge, we now have that understanding. Ecosystem collapse means that actually it causes not just us problems, but it causes problems in different continents, different places across the world. So we have a cause and effect where something can happen in one continent, but it can have adverse impact on countries in a completely different continent. And this is about how do we govern this, how do we move forward, and how do we ultimately stand up and take account for our actions?
You asked the question, what do we do about climate change? And I think the simple answer is we fix it. But of course, the real problem is why aren't we fixing it? And I think we need to move back a step before we have this conversation. I think there's two problems with it. One is we need to cool our conversation. As Jonathan started off with, there's a lot of polarization in this conversation. There's a lot of people saying, oh, it's not happening at all. It's just a left-wing conspiracy to raise taxes. Or on the other hand, it's the end of the planet and we got to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at it. Both of these are probably well-intentioned, but I think they end up placing us at an impasse. We can't actually get any action to go forward because it becomes this intractable, polarized conversation. But that's only part of it. The other part of the reason is that we don't seem to want to recognize there's a very simple reason why it's really, really hard to stop emitting CO2. Basically because fossil fuels powers everything we like about civilization. Remember, we don't burn fossil fuels to annoy Al Gore. We burn it because it brings us food, it brings us heat, it brings us cool, it brings us all the stuff that we like about civilization. And by the way, there's about 3 billion people who would really like to get on to this wagon of using fossil fuels. So if we want to get to a solution, we got to cool our conversation, and then we got to start realizing we cannot just make nice treaties where we say, oh, could you please turn off the fossil fuel use? What you have to do is to make green energy dramatically cheaper. And that's why I argue if we're going to focus on solving global warming, we have to start thinking about investing dramatically more in innovation into green energy. Because as long as green energy is more expensive than fossil fuels, we'll never get anywhere. As soon as it gets cheaper than fossil fuels, we've solved the problem. So this really is a problem about innovation. So the simple solution to what should we do about global warming is cool our conversation, spend a lot more on investment in research and development, and that will actually long-term solve this problem.
The world in which we live is not the same as that of our great-grandparents, still less that of our great-great-grandparents. Those of you who know a bit about geology will know that the Pleistocene ice ages ended about 11,000 years ago. Since then, we've had a lovely warm period called the Holocene. Now, what seems to be happening at the moment, and this has been attested by geologists the world over, what we have at the moment is something new, which is a new epoch beginning, which has been rightly called the Anthropocene. In other words, that epoch in the world's history when one particular animal species, our own, is changing the character of the surface of the Earth, its seas, and its atmosphere. Now, once you recognize the existence of the Anthropocene, which people believe that geologists from, let's say, 100 or 1,000 years hence would immediately detect when they started to look at the surface of the Earth. Once you recognize the concept of the Anthropocene, then you realize we're in a new situation, which means we have to think differently about almost everything. Now, climate change is not the only problem that is caused by humans. The proliferation of the human animal, what has rightly been called global swarming, is itself a very nice idea. You've got to think also about the way in which we're using up resources which can't be replenished. You have to think about the way we pollute the air, the sea, and the land. You've got a whole variety of things. But the climate change is a very important one among them. It's not the only one.
I think we do need to get back to common sense and above all to reason in what has become a highly emotional, as people have said, a highly polarized debate. And that's why I called my short book on the issue An Appeal to Reason, because that is greatly needed. And there are appalling things that are happening in the world today. Probably the most appalling is the examples we see all around us of what Alexander Pope called man's humanity to man. The terrible things, for example, I mention this only because it has been most in the headlines recently, the terrible things that are happening in Syria. The appalling